Welcome to the Qasim Rashid Show, a civil rights lawyer here to expose all forms of injustice with a sprinkling of dad jokes in between. Here's your host, Qasim Rashid.
Good morning and peace be upon you this beautiful Sunday, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Qasim Rashid, and this is the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. My friends, thank you all for tuning in. I love you guys. You guys are amazing. Your emails, your notes, your text, your tweets, they mean the world to me. So keep them coming and keep the conversation going. Some of you have been pitching me new guests, which we're vetting, and we'll try to bring on as many as we can. But look, at the end of the day, this show works because you guys listen and you guys share the content. We've got a great show lined up for today. It is Juneteenth week, and I'm excited to bring on a scholar, Dr. Fatima Fanoussi. She's a brilliant historian of 19th and 20th century American religion, its interplay with civil rights, Islam, Christianity, Judaism. She's fantastic, and I could listen to her talk forever because she's very, very good at what she does. And I promise you, you're going to learn a ton of new things that you did not know. So stay tuned for that. I also want to discuss about Captain Muhammad Khan, which I've spoken about briefly in the past, but I want to do a deeper dive, especially as we're talking about Juneteenth and we're talking about the impact of the Civil War, emancipation. The story of Muhammad Khan is one that often goes untold. He was a brown Muslim immigrant who was a Civil War hero who fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, and this did a phenomenal story and phenomenal background. And then a quick update, quick is the wrong word, but a detailed update on the genocide in Gaza and where we are right now. So much misinformation floating around about that right now, and it's truly frustrating to see. It's coming. It's the gaslighting is coming from our own government, and I know that's not new, but it's just frustrating to see it happen again in real time. In particular, because now the UN has actually passed a binding Security Council resolution that requires a complete ceasefire, an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages from both sides. Yes, both sides. There are about 3,500 Palestinian hostages on the Israeli side, and a withdrawal of troops from Gaza. And it's being ignored, and it's being ignored not by Hamas. That's the crazy part, being ignored by Israel, who is being very adamant about ignoring it. We'll come back and talk more about that. But when we come back from break, I'm excited to bring on Dr. Fatima Fanoussi, brilliant historian and scholar. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. I am excited to welcome somebody I deeply care about. It is Juneteenth week, and Dr. Fatima Fanoussi is here. She is a historian of 19th and 20th century American religion. Her research shows a deep study of African American Islam, in particular, the modern civil rights movement and Islam in the West. She is one of the, if not the premier scholar, certainly in the West, on the pioneering role of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and African Americans in the development of Islam in America. I've talked in the past about the major impact of Islam in terms of how up to 30% of enslaved Africans were Muslim and kind of the systemic targeting of those communities. Dr. Fanoussi's work is some of the work that I've cited in the past, and her leadership in this space is absolutely pivotal. She is a lecturer in the Islamic Studies Department at Johns Hopkins University, a historian for Howard Thurman Historical Home in Daytona Beach, Florida. She holds a bachelor's in history and Arabic from Lincoln University, a master's in history from Tufts, and a PhD in American history from Howard University. So as you can tell, she's done her homework. Fatima, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Qasim, for having me here. Yes,
I know it's always awkward having your bio read out in front of people. I'm the exact same way, but to me, one of the things that I really focus on, what I love bringing scholars and academics and the people who walk the walk on this program, because I think that's what our listeners really appreciate. They want to hear from the leading intellectuals. And it is Juneteenth week. So let me start with that. Um, uh, you know, really broadly, and this is just from a very personal standpoint, what does Juneteenth mean to you? How do you kind of engage with this holiday? And then the second part of the question is, I'm not African American. I'm Pakistani American. How should us non-African American people understand Juneteenth and engage and learn from this holiday?
so yeah, so well, first I just want to say Assalamu alaikum, which is just, greetings of peace and with God's name, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer. What does Juneteenth mean to me? For me, Juneteenth is when I think of Juneteenth, which I know is emancipation, it conveys a deep respect for my own personal history as an African American and for those early antebellum generations of African Americans. But I do think that Juneteenth is a celebration for everyone. Um, and I guess in answering that question, I want to emphasize three things, and I'm telling myself three things so I can get in and out of this quickly because
Yeah.
I could say a lot of it. Faith in God, expressed through covenant and deeds or work, responsibility, and I equate responsibility with freedom, and then an awareness or knowledge of history. I think when we talk about celebrating Juneteenth, or when we talk about what it means, that we should keep those three things in mind, because the enslaved Africans, many of them who were Muslims and other religions beside Christianity, but many of them came to practice Christianity or practice some type of faith where they actually formed a covenant with God. And we know that God forms covenants with people throughout human history across time and space. And although the enslaved were largely illiterate, we have record of their covenant in the preservation of what were known at that time as the slave spirituals or the Negro spirituals. You had visitors coming from all over the country, Yankees and all over the world, Europe, who often would go right to the slave cabins to listen to this music that conveyed such emotion and such otherness, spirituality, that many people have never heard before. But the lyrics of many of those spirituals, actually, in there we see the covenant, where we see that soul, that human being under bondage, under terrible oppression, but still seeking submission with his or her creator. And in the case of the enslaved, they're asking, well, I know there must be a God. And they're asking God for deliverance. And I think this is very important when we think about Juneteenth, because they're not asking God for deliverance for themselves. They're not asking God for deliverance from the children that are sold away from them. And in some instances, they never have a chance to know, or even their grandchildren. They're asking deliverance for descendants that will come well after they have departed this earth. And that's the covenant that I'm talking about. Like I said, every people has a covenant, and they upheld their covenant. And through both their belief, through their deeds, and then through that responsibility, and historians have searched and looked, and they can trace the effort of the enslaved human being, to assume responsibility for his or her life. And that was not always possible. But when we talk about emancipation and Juneteenth, we talk about an entire people looking to claim responsibility for their own selves, for their own lives, for how they dress, for their ability, even just being able to cover parts of their bodies that they couldn't with, the limited clothing that they're allotted, to eat what they want, to educate themselves, freedom over their bodies, their families, their children. And so that, for me, Juneteenth, it's this deep sense of respect for that history. And it's not just African American history, it's history for all Americans, and for everyone to understand. And then there's also the understanding of Juneteenth as a commemoration of the tensions that are within American society. And by
Sure.
tensions, on the one hand, we have this promise of freedom and dignity. Not just for American citizens, but for anyone who knows the history of this country, this is an invitation that Americans are alleging, for freedom and dignity to the entire world. So we can look at Juneteenth as a reminder and a recognition of how that promise of freedom and dignity can be abused or corrupted. And so this African American narrative and story of us as citizens, our pathway to human respect, how we were always looking for dignity and dignity based on our humanity, not any false distinctions
Mhm.
made or created by human beings, but human respect and respect as creatures created by God, as sons and daughters of Adam, and also citizenship. This is a commentary on the tensions that are embedded within American society, and so I think Juneteenth conveys both of those things for me, and I think that those lessons are there for. I mean, I could go into that in greater detail, but they're there for everyone. It doesn't matter your ethnic heritage, your racial, religious, gender, whatever types of divisions that we can think of, or whatever types of distinctions we have in our identity as human beings. This is the story of any human being or any people overcoming oppression, is a story of the resilience of humanity, of the human spirit, the triumph of the human spirit over oppression and wrong. So I think that's I think that if we understand Juneteenth and emancipation as a conferring of responsibility, and at least that's the way the freed men and women took it, then we realize that we're looking at the celebration of something, of a period, of the beginning. I look not so much to what the freeing, but what came at that moment. That
Mhm. Yeah.
1865 to 1900, throughout the 1900s, that period witnessed what was arguably um, the biggest set of gains and transformations of a people in human history during such a short time. It's a testament to not so much American exceptionalism or African American exceptionalism, but again to the triumph of the human spirit
Sure.
in submission to the Creator. And it should engender optimism and a spirit of self-reliance and hope, and a determination to fight for justice among all of us.
And I want to do a deeper dive into that part of it because of the impact it has today and the roles and responsibilities that we need to fulfill today. And if you're just tuning in, we're speaking with Dr. Fatima Fanusi, currently co-chair of the Religion and Cities Unit for the American Academy of Religion, historian, scholar. I read her bio, listened to the start of the show. It's a long and beautiful bio. But diving into this point you make, Fatima, about the obligation that we have today to continue that tradition. What does that look like? And in particular, what does that look like for us non-African Americans? My family doesn't have a history of this, I can't trace my ancestry back to enslavement. There's other colonial issues, Pakistan and the British, that's a different conversation. But how do we embrace it? How do we recognize that covenant that you talked about that they made, that prayer they made to God, that covenant for future generations? How do we embrace that and maximize that and appreciate that in the way it should be respected?
Yeah. Well, I go back to those three things, the faith in God expressed through the covenant and the deeds, the work, the responsibility or freedom, meaning assuming responsibility to the extent that one can in every situation. And I know and I guess I would say I want to, because we can look at so many instances and conditions of oppression that are still happening today in American society and throughout the world, especially whether we're looking at the situation of Palestinian, or it doesn't, we can, of Ahmadiyya in Pakistan, we can look at oppressed, um, we can look at injustice. That's what I'll say. And I think that one of the things that we can take specifically from the example of these freed men and women who gained their freedom collectively as a whole on June 19th, 1865. That's when the last of the enslaved men and women understood and realized that they were now legally free
Mhm.
according to the laws of the United States. The lesson that we have there is I would say what we can take from that is the recognition of human dignity. and what's associated with it. So I know that justice means different things to different people, but I think that for me personally, if I can look anywhere and identify one person or a group of people who are not allowed access to what's associated with human dignity and freedom, then I feel that there's an obligation for me to act with my hands, my voice, however I can. So the first thing I would say is just for, look at our condition, look at our neighborhoods, look at our communities, look at our micro relationships. How do we behave toward our family, toward our neighbors? Do our neighbors know us? And these are all little things, but then once you go start on that smaller level with your family unit, how you treat your spouse, your significant other, your children, your siblings, your parents, moving beyond that to the people on your street. Do your neighbors know you if they need something? And then the people that you work with, your jobs, and going on and on to these, these concentric and then these expanding circles that make up our community and our society. And of course, this goes on to include the political level, the, economic, so everything. But looking at our condition, looking at the condition of those around us, asking ourselves, are we satisfied with this? Are we satisfied with what we've done with this? And if we're not, then what can we do to improve and to change things? And
Yeah. Yeah,
oh,
no, that makes sense. I mean, and I think the really genuine theme is these are all things within our capacity. There's nothing, we don't need to lift a mountain over our heads. These are just basic, clear, direct instructions that unfortunately we've seemed to have gotten away from. But it's a reminder that the founders of this country, when I talk about the founders, I don't mean the colonizers. I mean, I'm talking about these enslaved icons who made this prayer, this covenant for freedom in the future, that they've exemplified against the most horrific obstacles. I want to shift a little bit and kind of move forward in the timeline, because we've talked about the post Civil War decades in the early 20th century as well briefly, but I want to do a deeper dive about the role of the civil rights movement and its intersection with the growth of Islam as an organized religion in America as well. One question I've always had is why is there such a lack of connection between the two? Like, there's very little scholarship that really talks about this. We're not taught in schools about this. As an American Muslim growing up, I had zero idea that Islam played that significant of a role in early African American history, or that Muslims played that significant of a role or any role in the civil rights movement. Why is that? And does that, do you think, correspond with why there's such a proportionately fewer number of African American Muslims as used to be perhaps in the 18th and 19th century?
so I'd have to break down what you're saying. So if you go into the 18th century, um, any Muslims of African descent are definitely going to be African Muslims enslaved here. If you're talking the 1700s, et cetera. And the same for that's the 19th century. You're talking, but and I apologize because I think this veers a little bit away from the question that you're trying to get to, but just the historian
Go
in
for
me.
it. Do your thing.
Clear that, yeah. So African Muslims were brought as captives over here and sold into slavery and lived, but and many of them brought Islam with them. Indeed, many of them actually had the Quran memorized in their heads, So there you have, of course, this vibrant tradition of Islam and Islamic civilizations throughout sub-Saharan West Africa. But and a good number, I mean, scholars, the estimates vary, but some say, anywhere between 12 to 15, I've heard all the way up to 40%. But whatever that correct number is, we know that we had Muslims who were here as enslaved people in America. I don't think Islam survived intact as a religion of the book among Africans and Muslims and their descendants. I know that many lived and died, but I think when you get into the 19th century, by the end of slavery, emancipation, Juneteenth, the time that we're talking about, for all intents and purposes, Islam living as a religion of the book, people reading the Quran and trying to live their lives in accordance with that, and the Sunnah or example of Muhammad the Prophet, that had filtered out. Now, we could go into so many examples of famous African Americans who probably had a parent or a grandparent who were Muslims, and they have memories. You know, Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery starts out with one of his earliest memories being his grandmother on a prayer rug facing the east right before the sun comes up, and praying in a language he didn't understand, and bowing her head on the floor in what we know to be the sujood, the position of the salat, the 5 required prayers. So, and that's just one example, but African American history is replete with those. But that's why I like to emphasize that covenant, that searching and looking for something and making a pledge with God, even after the language had been stripped from the descendants, and the religion and other parts of their culture prior to the Middle Passage and enslavement here. When we get to the 20th century, the early 20th century, that's when we have the beginning of Islamic movement, proto-Islamic movements, and then Islam itself, Islam proper. We have missionaries coming from overseas, primarily the Ahmadiyya coming from what was British India at that time. And African Americans disproportionately are among the Americans, you know, more than any other group. They are the Americans who are responding to the call of Islam, whether it's coming from Mufti Muhammad Sadiq and other Ahmadiyya, or the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, or you have, I guess one thing I could say without going into a whole history lesson is that beginning in the early 20th century, almost all efforts for the liberation of African Americans had some links to either Muslims or Islamic or proto-Islamic organization among African Americans. And I mean, what I mean by that is, and this is prior to the modern civil rights movement that you referenced earlier, but whether we're talking about Marcus Garvey, we know that he was a protege of Deuce Muhammad Ali in London when he worked with him, and that Deuce Muhammad Ali had relearned his religion from Khawaj Kamaluddin, an Ahmadiyya lawyer in England. And I just lost track of where I
Well,
was
no, I
going.
mean, I think the point you're making is that connection of scholarship, of influence is definitely there. I'd love to kind of then ask, what role did early Muslims play in the civil rights movement in the United States? Because you obviously have, you know, the Civil War end in April of 1865. You had attempts to pass civil rights legislation, which the Supreme Court, which is a white supremacist court, struck down by 1882 and undid and said, no, 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 no. The 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments don't actually mean that African Americans are equal human beings. No, no. Where'd you get that silly idea? Let's bring on the Jim Crow laws. And then those obviously were on the books until 1965. But there was obviously a heavy influence. And some of the more common names, you know, you mentioned Marcus Garvey, who I don't think was Muslim, but, you know, obviously you have Malcolm X, you have the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But what role did Islam or Muslims play in the civil rights movement? Again, this is not something that I've seen taught in schools, but really would love to hear your scholarship in this space.
Okay, I guess I would separate that into two. Yeah, you said what role did Islam and what role did Muslims play? So I guess I would say for Islam, and this isn't a comprehensive answer, but if I could focus on one or two things, Islam brought a sense of I was talking about human dignity back, you know, and you just mentioned the Jim Crow laws. There was so much in American society designed to psychologically oppress African Americans, particularly. And Islam brought a sense of dignity back for a class or group of African Americans who remained on the peripheries even of Afro-American society. So I'm not even talking about being integrated into mainstream in a time and era when Jim Crow was the rule, not the exception, was the legal, was the law of the land. But even when we talk about the social, the economic factors, the education that is needed for people to reintegrate them or integrate themselves back into society, mainstream society, that happened for a portion of African Americans, but not for all African Americans. All African Americans were vitally, I think, important to the economy of American societies through slavery
Sure.
and through Jim Crow. But once the economic value, especially of African American men, young men, once that started to be redistributed to other groups, um, and then you're left just with this, a group of folks people who are, what do they say, last hired, first fired,
Yeah.
lowest
Yeah.
jobs, worst jobs, no access to equal to education for many at all, and then not to equal education. So you have I guess the reason I'm taking so long to paint this picture is because if you want to ask about the impact of Islam, I think you really need to look at the role that Islam played in giving a sense of dignity to African Americans who had not received any piece of that American dream. So
Sure.
1965, I mean 1865, the entire African American community, the two institutions, when I talked about African Americans making progress quicker in the amount of time that they did in almost any other group in human history, that you have the church and then you have African Black schools or colleges, universities, normal schools, etc. And those two institutions really helped drive African Americans out of illiteracy and poverty into, but again, that was just a group. But for
Yeah.
those African Americans who were not members of the middle class or educated class within Afro-America, they were more on the peripheries and more forgotten. And so Islam comes in different forms, proto-Islamic forms, actual Islam coming from Ahmadiyya missionaries, very, very, very few Muslim missionaries coming from parts of from the Muslim world with the intention of bringing Islam to Americans outside of the Ahmadiyya community. But what happened there, especially in what we have with the Nation of Islam and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, is the approach to freedom and liberation has always been multi-pronged. And we know about the assimilation, we know about integration tactics, we know about the work of Charles Hamilton Houston and his team of lawyers at Howard University who worked to literally overturn the legislation that made African Americans, and not just African Americans, anyone who wasn't considered Anglo-Saxon or European or Caucasian, to prevent them from access to full citizenship. So those laws were fought through the courts, and that was one approach. And then we know about the test cases to integrate schools that were initially for school children, and then the decision was made to do this at the college and university levels. We know about the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Shop" campaigns, and so we have these approaches. But we also had Booker T. Washington, who his famous speech that many people, including African Americans, especially later in history, in the hindsight, really were critical of. But that speech at the Atlanta Cotton Exposition, where Booker T. Washington told African Americans to lay down your buckets where you are, cast them down, and all things social, we could be as separate as the five fingers in the hand. Now, he hadn't anticipated the shift from agrarian culture to industrial, but he was still saying a form of do for self and look at your condition, pursue freedom for your. And so we have doing for self, we have integration, we have assimilation. And those were always parts of a multi-pronged strategy to achieve freedom and liberation for African Americans. And once the strategy became, in the late 40s, early 50s, once we started winning court cases and that kind of thing, there was an almost exclusive, there was a shift to say the only approach to freedom and liberation should be assimilation and integration, and everything else we should kind of do away with other things. Now, that was fine if you were prepared to attend the University of Massachusetts or whatever schools that are being sued. But if you couldn't read, that did nothing for you.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so, right. And so Islam, especially when we talk about the Nation of Islam and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, now we have a movement that starts in the 30s when we're in the midst of the Great Depression, and that is telling these African Americans, you have an identity other than the identity of slave, former slave, and Black pariah who is relegated to the bottom of our caste system in America, in Jim Crow America. You have an identity other than that. It's an identity that has been given to you by God. And remember, although we had the Black church and although we had Christianity, we also had the problem of the ideology of white supremacy as embedded in the idolatry within the church, when you have this icon of a European man with blonde hair and blue eyes that we're worshiping as the divine. So that did a psychological number two on people who had no access to the regular trappings that we associate with citizenship and human dignity in American society. So Islam's most foremost contribution to the freedom and liberation movement, and it's not the only contribution among African Americans during the civil rights era, in my opinion, in my professional opinion, was in the generating of an identity as Muslims and a culture of based on Islamic concepts, schools that were Islamic, proto-Islamic and then Islamic, beginning in the 30s and then stretching all the way to the Clark Muhammad school system, where you had Clark Muhammad elementary schools and going up through 8th grade, and in some cases high schools in almost every major urban city in the country. But if we stay within the civil rights era, these schools, these newspapers, the Muhammad Speaks, that kind of thing, they helped to generate a culture that didn't just influence African-American Muslims or African-Americans who converted to Islam and identified as Muslims, but it contributed to a culture that influenced African-Americans at large through music and you had plays, you just had so much going on culturally. And this, of course, also African-American Islam influenced musicians, it influenced
jazz musicians. Yeah, I mean, to be a jazz musician at the time was to be a Muslim, and particularly many of them were members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I was fortunate to know some of these juggernauts who recently passed, Ahmed Jamal, Yusuf Lateef, God have mercy on them. But, I was a kid at the mosque and just seeing these musicians, I'd be like, yeah, these are just musicians. And as I got older, I'm like, oh my God, these are the musicians. These are the people. If you're just tuning in, we're speaking with Dr. Fatima Fanusi, a religion historian scholar. And I wanted to double down on one of the points you made about when we talk about the human dignity that Islam gave. What you're saying is not controversial. This was acknowledged by Christian scholars at the time as well. I was doing some research on this, and I found this event was attended by a missionary of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, a man named Sufi Mutir Bengali. This is in 1931, where it says that the speakers include representatives of several religions and races. The most prominent speakers were the dean of the University of Chicago and the attorney Clarence Darrow, who began the forum by stating, quote, that Christianity is not going to overcome racism in the United States, end quote. And then this article goes on to say the Christian ministers who were present agreed with him, right? They're saying, yeah, you're right. I wrote this paper in law school under Professor Jonathan Stubbs, and I found the scholarship of an influential Christian minister, Edward Wilmot Bladen, who lamented, and he writes that, these are his words, wherever the Negro is found in Christian lands, he is slow and unprogressive. There is no Christian community of Negroes anywhere which is self-reliant and independent. On the other hand, there are numerous Negro Mohammedan communities and states in Africa which are self-reliant, independent, and dominant. He uses the word dominant. That's powerful.
Who are you quoting again? I missed the quote. Who are you quoting?
This was Edward Wilmot Bladen.
Bladen, that's what I thought. So,
yeah, in 1887.
Yeah.
I mean, we're 150 years ago now.
And I missed the name, and then who you quoted, and then I was like, wait, that sounds like Blyden. So
yeah.
Blyden wrote, I mean, he wrote in all the 19th century Christian media, print media of the time, and then eventually his essays, he collected them all and printed them in one book called Islam, Christianity, and the Negro Race.
Yep,
and you're right, it's in
yep.
the 19th century. And some scholars actually suspect that Blyden actually converted to Islam during his time as a missionary, over in Africa. Who knows? He was definitely favorable to Islam, and Garvey popularized. But Blyden was writing as an erudite, scholar, and he wasn't, the majority of African Americans didn't have access to him, definitely not in the 1850s,
Yes.
I mean 1880s, especially when so many were not even reading. But Marcus Garvey, it reintroduced Blyden to African Americans at the mass level.
Right.
And that's another reason why when we talk about bringing Islam in, we have Garvey in there, because Garvey's people wouldn't have known about Blyden, and Blyden is making this pointed critique of the white supremacy embedded in Christianity. And also as your quote shows, and he goes on in other places to say, Christianity is not a fit religion for the Negro race. And
He's very blunt about it. He's very blunt about it.
but you also touched on something else when you talked about that meeting with Bengali and the response of the Christians who were present, which is that whole the fact that America itself and Western Christian European societies were having their own, not at the rank and file level, but among the religious thinkers, among the
Yeah.
theologians, among the scholars, they were having their own moment of crisis regarding their faith because of, higher criticism, which came out of Germany, and which said, look, they're asking themselves, is our Bible sufficient for the modern times? Like,
Yeah.
can we justify it? We're reading things in it that aren't rational, that contradict reason, that contradict science. And so you have this movement away from biblical lyricism. And that's a moment where you definitely have this intersection of Islam, not just with the civil rights movement, is Islamic engagement with American religious society really starts on a concentrated level in those last few decades of the 19th century, and it's initiated by Indian Ahmadiyya Muslims. And that will have a ramifications because most European Americans who are rejecting biblical literacy and rejecting the doctrines of atonement and the Trinity and all of these things, because the majority of them don't embrace Islam. I think you see Ahmadiyya then concentrating the efforts as the 20th century moves on among African Americans. Of course, it's not
Yes.
limited to, but African Americans are the group that will come in larger
Absolutely.
numbers.
Well, and we're down to our last 5 minutes, and I wanted to close with that. So I'm glad you segued perfectly to that. I promised that wasn't scripted. She's just that good. I think about the scene of early 1920s in the throes of Jim Crow America, where there's a mosque on the south side of Chicago, where the imam is an Indian missionary, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq. He's wearing, this turban. He's wearing this long etchkin, completely out of, the attire of what a traditional American of any race or background would wear. Really stands out. And I'm reading this excerpt that by the second year of its mission in the United States, the then Ahmadiyya movement had developed an adversarial relationship with the American media and with mainstream Christianity. And it goes on to say that Mufti Muhammad Sadiq was no longer a humble saintly martyr, but instead a bitter and angry opponent of white mainstream Christianity and racism in America. He had been fooled by the United States' outward image as a place of freedom and equality in a decade when both Protestant and Catholic churches had, quote, failed largely to abandon racism either at the altar or through their secular policies, end quote. And so, I have to imagine that this mosque where he's leading, where there are African Americans and white Americans and Latinos, maybe men and women worshiping together, this has to be one of the few places in the country where this is happening as a means of normalcy. And he writes in his publication, The Muslim Sunrise, that in a mosque, there is no racial superiority. We all stand together. There's no economic superiority. We all worship together. You could be a poor pauper and sit in the front, or a wealthy lord and sit in the back, and you are all equal in the eyes of God. I'd love for you to talk about that. What role did the Ahmadiyya Muslim scholars play in this Jim Crow era, and how significant was it that they actually had interracial worshiping as not some, left-wing ideal, but as the norm of what Islam taught, back to your point earlier about kind of embracing humanity in this space?
Okay, well, that's an
A
entire
lot.
part, not a 2-minute response, but I'll try. Yeah, that's, I mean, in a nutshell, the simplest answer is they played the most pivotal role. Without them, you would
Wow.
not have the formation of Islam as an American religion. And by American, I mean Islam as practiced here.
When you say they, you're saying the Ahmadiyya Muslim community played the most pivotal role in the development of Islam in America,
Yes,
20th century. That's a
that's
powerful.
and that's there's a whole seminar that could go after that, but
We'll
that
have you back on to discuss that, but continue,
yeah,
please.
yeah. So and then illustration that you just gave us of Mufti Sadiq at the mosque, that's history. You have a few historians who are talking about it right now. Sally, now I can't remember her last name, but she writes on Islam in Old Detroit, and she gives the Ahmadiyya, she recognizes that they're the ones pioneering this Islamic growth in Detroit. And I just want to bring up Detroit as a microcosm, and you're also talking about some of the same parts of the country. You did have Muslims who immigrated, who migrated, who came to America to live after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, especially from those Levantine countries. Most of them, and this is not said in a critical way, most of them were coming here for economic reasons and for reasons for material reasons and there's no problem with that. And many of them practiced their Islam. Some of them did, some of them didn't. But what they weren't coming here to do was cultivate Islamic growth in American society. The group that was doing that were these Indian Muslim Ahmadiyya, and they did do exactly that. And so I guess there's the cultivation of Islamic growth. There's Islam as a major vehicle through in the freedom and liberation movement, and bringing human dignity to African Americans and to all of American societies, but through Islam. And then there is the scholarship that you talked about, the Ahmadiyya scholars, who I think were pioneers. They weren't the only people. They looked at the platforms that existed before them, especially among African American intellectuals during the last last few decades of slavery. People like Bishop Henry McNeil Turner and others. But these Ahmadiyya also mounted a fierce challenge to the ideology of white supremacy. And they did it they looked at the role of white supremacy religiously within Christianity. So kind of foreshadowing African-American thinkers like Howard Thurman, who wrote Jesus and the Disinherited. And so now there is this challenge to Christianity with a solution presented, and that solution being Islam, or at least the Quran, as a lens to clear up the confusion that Christian theologians and scholars, who whether they're sincere or not, were having with their own religion.
Wow, I wish we could go on forever. We're past my producer's yelling at me. We gotta get going. We'll have to have you back on, I promise. This was brilliant. And before we go, thank you, Professor, for everything. This was outstanding insight, and I'm gonna have to listen to the show again just to listen to you talk, because that part was phenomenal. How can folks get in touch with you if they have questions, if they want to support your work? What's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Sure. Reach out to me I'm a program director at The Best Way at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. That's located in Towson, Maryland. And my email there is last name Fanusie, FANUSIE @icjs.org. And that would probably be the best way to reach me.
Thank you, Fatima, for being with us today.
All right. Thank you for having me.
That is Dr. Fatima Fanusie, historian, scholar, and just an all-around amazing human being. We're going to be talking about this when we come back from break, but this is why you can see why I'm so glad that she accepted our invitation. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. That was Dr. Fatima Fanusie. Please do look her up. Her work is incredible. It's amazing. It's inspiring. And especially if you enjoy reading about history, especially if you enjoy reading about civil rights, especially if you enjoy reading about Christianity and Islam, she is the person that you want to read because she just brings brilliant scholarship. I want to talk about Private Muhammad Khan because his story is one that absolutely is inspiring. It's in the National Archives. There's never been a book written about him. I need to write a book because this guy's story is incredible. Private Muhammad Khan, also known as John Amahill. And the reason why I'm sharing this is Juneteenth week, there's a rising anti-Black violence, anti-immigrant policy, anti-Muslim hate. Khan's story pushes back against all that and shows what this country is supposed to be. He was one of only about 250 Muslim soldiers who fought in the Civil War. And his story is even more unique because he's one of only 2 Muslim soldiers who was also an immigrant. It might have been the only, one of 2 that got a pension, probably the only one who was also an immigrant. And he also fought in the very famous Battle of Gettysburg. And so his story, very quickly, born around 1830 or so, raised in Afghanistan, born in what's modern-day Iran, raised in Afghanistan. He immigrated to the US around 1861 during the period of antebellum America, and makes friends, gets there in like January, February 1861. April of 1861, as you know, Civil War breaks out, right? 2 months after he gets here. And so he's out with his friends, and his friends decide we need to enlist in the Union Army to defend this country and to end slavery. So he enlists in the 43rd New York Infantry Regiment. This was an all-white unit. And even though he wasn't white, in fact, he was described as having a particularly dark complexion, he evidently passed as white enough. And this is where his story really becomes powerful, because spent the first 2 years of the Civil War as a cook. But then in 1863, July, he fights in the infamous Battle of Gettysburg. In the ensuing confusion, he gets separated from his unit. Military police find him and they arrest him, not realizing that he actually is a member of the Union Army. Some say it's because his English wasn't great. Some say it was because of white supremacy. I say it was probably a combination of all of those things. So despite the fact that he enlisted to fight to end slavery, the white supremacy got him too. And they put him in a prison labor camp for escaped enslaved people in Philadelphia. He spends about 10 months trying to find anyone who will vouch for him so he can rejoin his unit. Finally, failing to do that, he escapes the prison labor camp, jumps on a train down to DC, and then marches 70 miles by foot down to Spotsylvania, Virginia, where he joins the Battle of the Wilderness on its last day and remarkably finds his unit. 15 minutes into the battle, he gets shot, and he still doesn't quit or leave the Civil War. He instead heals, comes back as a sharpshooter, and finishes out the Civil War to help the Union win. I mean, this is the very Cliff Notes version of it. He died on May 26th, 1891 in Manhattan, New York. And if you're in New York, if you're in Brooklyn, he's buried at the Cypress Hills National Cemetery in Brooklyn in Kings County. His burial plot is row 2, plot 5009. You can even find a picture of his tombstone online. And, I first learned about Muhammad Khan while researching for an opinion editorial on just the vast contributions that Muslims or Islam had made to America. And to see this story, I thought was pretty inspiring. It's unfortunate they don't teach this in schools, but it is a part of our history. And it speaks to the broader history of the unity that this country should be about. As I said, the U.S. Government National Archives has his full and complete 209-page pension preserved. And it's worth the read. It's hard to read because it's in handwriting, but it is powerful as well. All right, I wanted to share that positive story. I also want to share the update. The UN Security Council has passed a binding resolution with U.S. support to demand a permanent and complete ceasefire, a release of all hostages, Israeli and Palestinian, and a withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Hamas has come out and said, yeah, we accept, and let's figure out the details. For some reason, the U.S. government keeps saying that Hamas is not accepted, even though they're very public in AP, in various news articles that they have accepted. Meanwhile, Israel has not accepted, and the U.S. government keeps coming out and saying that they have, which is also mind-boggling, especially considering Netanyahu just put out a video slamming Biden for not giving him enough arms when I mean, it's mind-boggling because if anyone has given Israel unlimited access to arms, it's Biden. Biden circumvented Congress multiple times to send arms to Israel as well, which is also mind-boggling. Now, Biden has responded by publicly lashing out and canceling a meeting with Netanyahu, which, okay, but can we cancel the arms trade as well? Can we cancel sending bombs to Israel to bomb children? I mean, that's the logical thing to me to stop war crimes attested to by the UN, by the State Department, by the ICC, by the ICJ. But that's where we are right now. We're at this impasse where Hamas remarkably has said we accept these terms. Israel has refused to, and I'm not sure why the UN Security Council is not enforcing this, because that's what I thought they were supposed to do. But that's the world in which we live. So continue to stay active, continue to stay in the ear of your elected representatives. Do not relent. I spoke at my city council meeting again the other night, and it was kind of depressing because like 5 people showed up, 6 people showed up to speak, and we need 50, 60, 100 or more. So stay involved and stay engaged. It's the least we can do to uphold justice at this critical time in history. My friends, thank you for tuning in. I really, really appreciate you. Be sure to follow me on social media at Qasim Rashid across all platforms. If you're on Substack, be sure to subscribe to my content there as well. I will continue to advance advocacy that builds on compassion, justice, and accountability for those in power. Have a great show for next week. A scholar from Palestine, a Christian scholar from Palestine. So be sure to tune in, same time, same place at 10 a.m. on Sunday on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126. My friends, be fierce, lead with compassion and justice, and continue speaking truth to power. Till next week, peace.